Good afternoon or good morning from wherever you're coming from. Welcome everyone to Conversations That Matter. This is a webinar series sponsored by the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. And it focuses on the topic of human dignity and offers some pastoral strategies for addressing some of the pressing human dignity issues in the church today. So the next two conversations deal with the rise of the machines, how the internet, social media, and artificial intelligence are raising questions about what it means to be human in an increasingly digital world. So we're calling this two-episode mini-series The Virtual Apocalypse, Renewing Christian Culture in a Digital World. And this is episode 1, called The Art of Virtue. My name is Brett Robinson. I'm an associate professor of Catholic Media Studies in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame. The McGrath Institute for Church Life is an outreach unit at Notre Dame that connects the intellectual life of the university to the life of the church through teaching, research, and programming. So let's jump right in. If we're living in the information age, then we are all in formation. That is, we are rendered as digital information on screens and databases, and we're also being formed in a particular way by these new tools and systems and habits and behaviors. We are, in fact, in formation. But form for what? And form by what is the big question that inspired this series. So we're calling it Virtual Apocalypse, not because we are supremely pessimistic. First of all, it's a virtual apocalypse and not the real apocalypse. So no need to drop everything and get right with God, although that's never a bad idea. Instead, we are using it in the Greek sense of the term to uncover or reveal. And in Middle English, in fact, apocalypse meant vision or insight. And so we're interested in how we can gain deeper insight by seeing what's being revealed by these dramatic changes to the culture and ourselves by way of technology. And we have 3 expert guides to help us do that today. They come from both ends of the country. Michael Sacasas is in Florida at the Christian Study Center of Gainesville, but is perhaps best known for his insightful Substack and newsletter, The Convivial Society, as well as his writing in the New York Times and The Atlantic. Father Paul Soukup is coming to us from Santa Clara University in California, where he is professor in the College of Arts and Sciences, teaching courses in communications, technology, and theology. He also consults with the USCCB and has written a number of books and articles on communications, technology, and theology. And finally, Felicia Wu Song is a cultural sociologist teaching at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. Her book, Restless Devices, is a must-have for church leaders who are trying to navigate this digital world in a way that's consistent with a Christian understanding of the human person. So, before we jump in, a few things to note. If you're having any technical difficulties with sound or video or participating in the Q&A, please drop those in the chat. We want to hear your questions and comments, so please use the Q&A function throughout the episode and submit those, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible by the end of the hour. Our format today will be a roundtable discussion among our 3 panelists. And we'll begin with Dr. Song. So to set the stage, I want to pitch this question to you, Felicia. You've been studying this topic for a while. You recently spent time in Rome addressing the Vatican's dicastery for communication about this. So when we say digital technology, we're of course referring to the internet and smartphones and social media, artificial intelligence, all these tools and systems that are reshaping how we relate to one another and to reality. So if technology is reshaping, reforming our relationship to others, to time and space, to God, then maybe it's not surprising that things feel a little off kilter. You call it in your book a moment of digital discontent. Could you tell us kind of what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. When I say we're in a time of digital discontent, I'm referring to this uncomfortable sense that we have that something isn't quite right with the ways that our lives are carrying out. I think it's interesting to kind of see the arc of our digital adoption, at least in American society, that in the beginning there was a fair bit of enthusiasm, and we've adopted technologies into all aspects of our professional and personal lives. And there's a lot of pleasure and efficiency and convenience that comes out of that. But I think in the last, 5 to 7 years, people have started talking to each other, right, about actually feeling a bit overwhelmed by that inbox that never, stops filling up, and the constancy of the social media feed or instant or messaging, right, that one has to respond to, and so there's this feeling of feeling stuck, right, feeling like there's a lot of great stuff that comes out of our digital conveniences, but we also feel like we can't stop. And so even when we try to take a Sabbath or go on vacation or try to rest even in the evenings, right, we feel kind of restless, actually, right? We kind of
like
can't come down.
Is part of it there is this sort of classic kind of technology arc of optimism and utopianism, and then some of the problems surface and we get these darker visions of what might be happening. Is something weird going on with digital in the sense that it's not necessarily a straight line, because we have sort of internet, but then we have social media, and now we have artificial intelligence. Are we going through that cycle maybe even quicker? And maybe that's adding, do you think that's adding to maybe the discontent or discomfort?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we talk about the digital landscape, you're right. Like it's not like a constant, right? It keeps on shifting with each new device. And so I think there is, however, an increasing sense of ubiquity, right? Like there's nowhere you can turn, right? In your work, in your friendships, in your church life, where you're not having to navigate how one deals with the digital. And certainly the pandemic in recent years hasn't helped, right? That kind of amplified all of our reliance on tech. But I think what's interesting to me is the way in which it's our relationships with our digital devices isn't just about the actual behaviors of being on our screens or feeling compelled to be on our screens. It's actually become a kind of state of consciousness, right? It like lives with us, this sense of, oh, there's emails to check, or there's messages I need to respond to, or there's posts, right, that I just posted and I'm interested in if anyone acknowledged that I exist, right? All those kinds of things are constant in our minds, even when we are not necessarily on our devices. And I think we have this intuitive sense, right, that not only something not quite right, but as you mentioned before, with all the kind of added layers of new technologies, this isn't going to stop, right? There's kind of this sense of like, it's just going to get worse. Meta, right? Virtual reality, all this stuff. It's just like more and more and more, and kind of a wondering of like, how am I going to not just keep up, but just manage, right? All these different aspects.
In a Christian context, then it seems like there's this kind of intractable problem of, we want to promote the gospel, we want to share these messages, we have all these new means to do that. We've always done that through history, through different means of communication, new means, and yet there's this unease or dis-ease among those who use these frequently, and so we reach kind of a little bit of a cognitive or spiritual impasse where the effects of the device perhaps are diffusing or undermining the Christian message perhaps that we're trying to convey through it. How do you kind of reconcile that in what you've been studying? I know you do a lot of interviews as sociologists. Like, what are you hearing kind of on the ground among Christians who are navigating kind of these two poles of digital experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for people of faith, it is the challenge is trying to have a well-ordered life, right? I mean, in the end of the day, I think that is the best framework for thinking about technologies in the context that we live in. Because on the one hand, the temptation is just to say, well, there's too many negative forces being formed negatively by these digital practices and devices, so much so that I just need to get rid of them, right? So one way is to just, okay, I'm just going to pitch it all, right? The other way is you could take the path of, well, my work requires this, my personal relationships require, my family is spread out all parts of the world, right? So this is inevitable, a kind of technological inevitability. We just have to put up with it and live our kind of pious lives over here. But the technology is, the rest of it. But I think there's something, the complicated space, in some ways, those are the easy poles. The more challenging space is trying to figure out, how do I faithfully live into not only the missional call of what it means to follow Christ, but also I think the language is the anthropology, the theological anthropology of who God has created us to be as human beings. How do I live into all of that, embodied, relational, right? Capable of being present to God, others, myself.
You mentioned practices. I want to follow that line a little bit, because I feel like a lot of times the attention is focused on kind of content. So, if we clean up this content, or we censor this content and not that content, that will somehow, heal the culture or create a more civil space for us to do this as human beings. So when you hear about the problems like pornography or political polarization or distraction, it seems like a lot of those are maybe distractions from a deeper issue, which is how these forms and practices, habits, rituals, I think you even call them kind of like counterfeit liturgies, they're shaping culture in a sense more than the content they carry. So this is the old McLuhan idea, right? That in the industrial age, didn't matter if the train was carrying coal or cornflakes. The fact that we had trains just remapped everything. And I think the same can be said today with digital. It doesn't matter whether it's, whatever, Mr. Beast videos on YouTube or ChatGPT writing screenplays. It's reshaped everything: social life, economics, entertainment, research, habits, practices, behavior. So are there some maybe formal characteristics to help us see those kind of larger contours around how the form itself is shaping? And I assume there's some holdovers here from that industrial age too, but there's some of these I think you identify in your book that I think might be helpful for folks to hear about.
Yeah, for sure. I think, certainly one of the holdovers from the larger thrust of industrialization is the drive to quantify, right? Anyone who's on social media knows that if you're on that platform, right, it's built to numerically quantify how many people are following you, how much of affirmation or lack thereof you get for any utterance you make into the universe. And so I think when we step back and actually think about it, it's actually a really strange thing to quantify one's significance or the worth of one's words, right? But I think when one is in that space in a habitual way, right, one gets used to, right, and the quantification becomes normalized in how we evaluate each other, how we evaluate ourselves. I think a lot of young people know that the form of social media also drives us to perform, right? There's a lot of conversation about a lack of authenticity, the ways in which we create these perfect images of ourselves. And so all the communication that these communication technologies are supposed to be enhancing actually don't result in actual communication. We are merely broadcasting or performing for each other what we think others will affirm, right? And again, these aren't intentional, right? It's just the way the system is actually built to constantly reward these kinds of performances. And so that it's a subtle formation, right? And no one's actually going in thinking, oh, this is what I want to do. But it is the normalized habitual practice, right, of being in social media where it's you couldn't do otherwise, right? Or if you tried, you would be penalized.
Right. And that's such a good connection, because I think prior to the internet, we were habituated by television. So the performance impulse was already there. And then we got a stage to do it on. So, these metaphors and these holdovers from the industrial age matter today. And I think you point them out so so well and so clearly. It seems like there's also kind of in terms of quantification, if you look at ChatGPT, what it has done is kind of mathematized language, right? Like it's come up with these predictive algorithms to figure out which word comes next. And so now even language, which was, not part of mathematics, it was part of the trivium and so on. Now it's part of this sort of mathematical calculation, which takes it to a whole nother level. And I want to maybe follow a little bit along some things you were hinting at in terms of form and structure, that, and in a sense, like this is an environment that we've created, right? It's not, let me toss the device out and now I'm free. It's actually that I inhabit an environment that is very much structured by both these kind of industrial norms and kind of the bureaucratic apparatus and state that grew out of that. And now what has been called the technocratic paradigm, right? So Pope Francis talks about this in Laudato Si, how in fact, these tools aren't neutral because they're often controlled by certain powerful groups, economic, political groups. That encyclical, which I commend everyone to read if you haven't, is ostensibly about the environment, but it's also about these media environments. And he does kind of gesture in that direction throughout the encyclical. I'm wondering, Father Paul, if you could help us maybe unpack that a little bit, because you do this work in media ecology, which kind of brings together these two concepts. Help us make sense of this kind of environmental metaphor in a theological sense. What is media ecology, and how can it help us understand what the Pope is up to in Laudato Si?
I think we can do this by taking a step back in different ways, a step back in time and a step back in distance. You've hinted at some of this already, that if we're too close to something, we tend not to see it. When we get a little more perspective, as you mentioned about the train, it could be carrying cornflakes or it could be carrying coal. But we don't know that until we step back far enough to see what's in the train. Media ecology urges us to make that step back, to recognize that we live in a communication environment. And like any communication or any environment or ecosystem, we hit moments where things are more or less balanced out. Let me use the analogy, of a pond and the forest. And you get the frogs in the pond and the fish in the pond and the plants growing there and the bugs and the birds, and everything is balanced out. You put an invasive species in and it disrupts everything. And we're not quite sure what to do anymore. Well, that, in a sense, is what we've been doing with our communication over the last 100 years in a kind of rapid sort of way. We keep adding new invasive species. The most recent, just 15 years ago, is this. We all get our smartphones, and it changes everything. People don't speak on the phone anymore; they text. People don't read a newspaper; you have a news feed. People don't watch television. You get short videos. You can think of all of the different ways that our entire communication practice changes just when we introduce something new. And what that should do is help us focus a little bit on the larger environment. What was going on before we put this invasive species in? I mean, anytime we introduce something like that, we've got a moment of saying, all right, we've understood ourselves a little bit more.
When you say, sorry to interrupt, but when you say invasive, that sounds kind of like a negative, but in a sense, what you're saying is, like any ecosystem, the goal is to sort of reestablish an equilibrium. So if something new comes in, good or bad, the system itself needs to sort of recalibrate.
Exactly. Thank you for that correction, because invasive, I was using it in a neutral way, but you're right, it carries a negative connotation. Maybe that's part of our own default setting. We look at something new and we think, oh my goodness, what's this doing to us? Rather than what opportunities does it present to us? Because media ecology will tell us we need to think about technologies as having affordances. They allow us to do things, and we make choices about what we do. If we step back in that historical way, we can see it a little bit more clearly. So let's think of, sometimes people don't even realize it's technology, writing. Or if you want the technological side of it, you could think about printing. And we gradually take in this particular technological way of exchanging information, storing information, writing things which could be sent across distances. So I don't need to be in one place, but my thought can show up somewhere at great distances. We travel through time with writing. We look at materials that have come to us from thousands of years ago. And yet we also realize that that is not just a small kind of thing. There have been studies that can track how learning to write rewires the human brain. Human beings adapt to the use of that technology, and we begin thinking, literally thinking differently because we have a given technology. But that's not only at a personal level, it happens on a societal level too, because you think of all of the supporting things that make up an environment that's based on writing as an information process. And so you have everything from booksellers, you have people creating paper, we transform our entire way of living, and the environment adjusts to it. So it seems absolutely normal.
And when we move from one to another, say writing to print to electric to digital and so on, we don't lose the previous. No. So we have this accretion of modes. A friend of mine calls it nested epistemology. So, as little babies, we come to know the world through speech and orality and sound, and then we learn to read. And we build on each one. Do you feel like maybe, Felicia was talking about a little bit of this discontent and confusion around new tools. Have we reached a point where, a young child who's 2 or 3 is on an iPad has lost that kind of nested epistemology in the sense of, first learning the art of speech, then the art of writing, then you know what I mean? So it's sped up so much that we skip ahead and we lose the connection to those modes. And I think what media ecology says, and maybe you can help me here and correct it, is that there are different occasions for these sort of different affordances, that we don't get rid of the old ones. There's times where a handwritten letter would be nice. Like I'm raising teenagers and they think they can do everything through text. I can ask a girl out. I can also break up with a girl, all of this via this very impersonal medium.
But you should write your grandmother a handwritten note to say thank you.
Right. So that ecological awareness, how do you cultivate that? I think this is a really important question for the church, because there is this kind of progress impulse that, hey, there's a new tool, let's use it to its fullest. It's an opportunity, it's an affordance. And then we forget about some of these other modes of relationship that are actually, in some ways, a little more human. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that you're right and you're wrong. And so, yes, we carry all of these things with us. It doesn't disappear. I mean, the fact that I can have a smartphone that does all these things doesn't make me forget how to write or to read. And the technologies, as your friend said, can be nested, but we evolve along with those technologies. Just as the brain shifts to be able to handle writing, we also as a species begin to bring new things. The child who grows up with the technology doesn't even see it as a technology. It's just simply the way the world is. In a sense, you sound a little bit like Plato, those millennia ago, worrying about writing. What's writing doing to us? Because Plato comes from an oral world and sees the threat of this technology. You jump forward 400 or 500 years and people see writing as absolutely normal. But then they worry about, adding something else. So I guess it's part of the innate conservatism of being human. We don't want to see something that we like go away. And we forget that we are evolving along with it. It's a way of being human that we adjust to these things. We create these environments. And then, in effect, the environments create us.
Let me muddy the waters a little bit more, Father. If we talk about the industrial and the digital, right? There's sort of two paradigms, but they're interwoven now. In the industrial age with factories and machines, we were extending our physical powers, right? Like McLuhan says that all technologies are an extension of the self or the human person. So the hammer extends the fist and so on. These machines make us more physically powerful to manipulate nature. It seems there's something fundamentally different about these media technologies and digital in particular, because the nature that it's manipulating is not physical nature, but psychological. So as Christians, we think of psyche or psychology as not just the mind, but the soul. So when these technologies start to infiltrate or reshape or reform the soul and shape them, if we're not conscious of that extension and that relationship, what do we need to watch out for? What are, again, going back to practices, like what does a Christian do to, again, what we do is we pursue God, and we pursue the life of the soul, the interior life. And it seems like that's where we are now with a lot of these tools. We're tinkering with the interior life, how we think and how we communicate. And the machines are starting to learn that too. What does Christian practice and tradition and teaching bring to that to help us navigate?
I think it brings a hope. I mean, if we look at Christianity, which is, in my mind, a religion of communication, it is the word that is made flesh, and it is the word that sustains us. And Christianity has never feared communication technology, and it is taken each one of those. I mean, if we take Anselm's kind of definition of theology as faith seeking understanding, that's something everyone does. And people have done this in every medium. When writing became, part of the Christian tradition, not just the oral gospels, but to write the gospels down, Christianity created a form, for passing that along, and eventually chooses the codex as a way that is more efficient than the scroll. The same thing when people reached out, those who were skilled in art began reflecting on their belief in artistic forms. And we can look at the ways the different artistic tools were used. Christianity did the same with music. It embraced not only musical tradition, but continues to develop it and invent new tools. And you look through at least Western Christianity, the use of musical instruments as ways of reflecting on belief. We get the same thing after the printing press. The key thing is the essay. It's not something that comes with a handwritten manuscript, but it's something that comes in a printed form, and we literally embrace this new technology to reflect on our faith. So we're constantly reflecting on our faith, and different generations will do it as people know those tools. I don't think we can just start from a priori and say, get rid of a given tool. No, let's let our Christian faith reflect on itself using the tools in the environments in which it is. I think the worst thing that we can do is worry. The best thing we can do is have hope and say, let's continue to work in this environment. Some things will flourish, some things will pass away, just as that metaphor of the pond and the forest. It reaches a new balance. But Christianity and faith doesn't go away. God is greater, as John writes in the first letter, than our consciences. God is greater than our imaginations.
So I want to bring, thank you, Father. I want to bring Michael into the conversation and maybe pursue this idea about, again, these Christian practices or virtues or habits that help us navigate each new iteration. I think we've established that we're in a confusing time, not necessarily because it's bad, but because we're learning something new, a new extension of the self. And as Father said, it actually affords us some great ways to reflect on our own beliefs and faith and tradition. And the internet happens to be a really, really, really powerful memory tool. And so you're seeing, I think, a lot of movements within the church and within Christianity of recovering older practices and learning all sorts of things about the faith and tradition and history of the church that weren't really accessible before. So I think that's another on the plus side of the ecology equation. But Michael, you've talked about this in connection with virtue formation, and in a recent article, you actually referred to certain media technologies as, quote, carefully calibrated engines of sloth, greed, envy, despair, and self-loathing. But you've also talked about the positives, but you've written extensively about this connection between our technological environment and virtue formation. So could you help us maybe understand that connection a little bit more? How are those two kind of worlds or practices connected?
Yeah, I will at least try. So my own interest in technology, I think, began taking shape around this particular question, in fact. So the the question took the form of something like this. I may have this set of expressed beliefs or these aspirations with regards to the sort of person that I want to be, the kind of family I want to raise, the kind of community I want to live in, et cetera. And we may hold these beliefs and aspirations very passionately and devoutly, and yet they don't tend to materialize for any number of reasons, of course. But one of the reasons why they may not materialize seem to have something to do with the shape and the contours of the technological environment in which I resided, which was the water I swam in. And understanding this, I think, became important to me because it was a matter of seeing that the technology around me was not neutral with regards to whatever my moral aspirations or my desires for the kind of society I wanted to inhabit might be. The technology wasn't simply a neutral tool, but was in fact interacting in a way where it might inhibit, it might support and sustain some of those aspirations, but it might also inhibit and preclude the possibility of fulfilling those aspirations. And so it seemed to me at the time, this was maybe 20 years ago, that not that many people were paying attention to that way in which technology was formative and not merely instrumental. So I thought about the way we are formed as human beings with regards to our character. And I sort of think in terms of the virtue ethic tradition with regards to the way that habits become ingrained in us and give us dispositions, and these become inclinations and then generate either virtues or vices, right? And this agglomeration of virtues and vices is our character. And then it was interesting to me to then think about if we think of habits, they can be intellectual habits, but they often are embodied habits. And we take up our tools through our body, right? So there's this interface, if you like, of the world, the tool, and the self through the body. And so the tools sort of enter into those cycles of moral formation, to those patterns of moral formation. In other words, we form habits through our tool use, not independently of them. The tools, they induce certain habits in us. They cultivate certain practices. They eliminate other practices.
So it's easy, seems to me it's easy to see the vices that might, and we've mentioned some already, whether it's pornography or gambling or political rancor. They're easier to see oftentimes as human beings. We tend to devolve to the lowest common denominator when it comes to these things. Help us, and this is for everyone really, I mean, what are the virtues, do you think, that are being cultivated in the new environment? And if that's too hard of a question, could you point to a previous environment and point to some virtues that grew out of that perhaps were strengthened in some way or enhanced by